Welcome to Auto Intelligence. I'm Steve, and I'm here with Claire, and we're both part of the Auto Agentic team. New episodes every Tuesday.
Whether you're starting your morning with coffee or catching up later, you're about to dive into one of the most significant automotive trade developments we've seen in years. And honestly, this story has layers that most people aren't seeing yet.
On January 16th, 2026, Canada and China announced a landmark trade agreement that fundamentally reshapes electric vehicle access in North America. But this isn't just another trade deal, it's a strategic inflection point that could redefine how we think about automotive intelligence, supply chain sovereignty, and the great power competition reshaping our industry.
Before we dive deep, let's acknowledge our growing auto intelligence community. Your topic suggestions and industry stories continue to shape what we cover. This episode was partly inspired by several listener emails asking us to connect the dots between trade policy and automotive intelligence architecture. And boy, do we have dots to connect today.
Here's what makes this story so compelling. Canada has agreed to slash tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to just 6.1%, while establishing an annual import quota of 49,000 vehicles that's set to grow to 70,000 within 5 years. But this isn't just about numbers, it's about Canada making a calculated geopolitical gambit that diverges dramatically from U.S. trade policy.
In exchange, China is reducing tariffs on Canadian agricultural products, particularly canola seed, from 84% down to around 15%. But here's where it gets strategically interesting. This deal is designed to attract what Prime Minister Carney calls considerable new Chinese joint venture investment in Canada's auto sector.
To understand why this matters, you need the historical context. We've seen this playbook before with solar panels, telecommunications, even steel. China builds massive production capacity, achieves cost leadership through scale and state support, then systematically captures global market share.
The difference here is that automobiles aren't just products, they're rolling intelligence platforms. Every modern EV collects terabytes of data about where we go, how we drive, even what we say. And now Canada is opening its market to vehicles manufactured by companies that, under Chinese law, must cooperate with state intelligence agencies.
The automotive industry learned hard lessons from the Huawei 5G situation. Western governments eventually banned Huawei from critical telecommunications infrastructure over security concerns. Yet here's Canada doing essentially the opposite with an industry that's becoming just as critical to national infrastructure.
Today, we're breaking down not just what this deal means for Canadian consumers, who might soon have access to $25,000 electric vehicles, but what it signals about the future of automotive intelligence, supply chain resilience, and the complex dance between economic opportunity and strategic vulnerability.
So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's decode how a trade deal in Ottawa could reshape automotive competition from Mexico City to Munich, and why your next car purchase might have implications for North American security architecture.
Let's start with the nuts and bolts, because the specifics of this agreement reveal not just trade policy, but a fundamental shift in how Canada thinks about its automotive future.
The core of this deal centers on Canada's dramatic tariff reduction, from the punitive 100% rate imposed in 2024 down to the most favored nation rate of 6.1%. That 100% tariff, by the way, was Canada's attempt to align with U.S. policy under the previous Trudeau administration.
The quota system is particularly strategic, 49,000 Chinese EVs annually, representing less than 3% of Canada's total new vehicle market. It's large enough to matter, small enough to manage immediate political concerns. But here's the kicker, it grows to 70,000 within 5 years.
But let's talk about what this means for actual Canadian consumers, because the pricing implications are staggering. By 2030, over 50% of these imported vehicles must be priced at 35,000 Canadian dollars or less. We're talking about BYD Seagull models potentially priced under 20,000 Canadian dollars. That's cheaper than most internal combustion vehicles.
Think about that competitive dynamic. Tesla's China-made Model 3 was selling for around 65,000 Canadian dollars before the tariffs. Now you've got BYD offering vehicles like the Atto 3, comparable to a Model Y in size, positioned near that $35,000 threshold.
The timing here is crucial. Canadian EV sales actually dropped 32% in the first 3 quarters of 2025. ZEV market share fell to 9.2% in Q2 2025, down from 9.7% in Q1. High prices have been the primary barrier to EV adoption.
And here's where Canada is making a fascinating bet on market psychology. Transport Canada has committed to expediting approval processes for new Chinese EV models, aiming for 8-week certifications. That's regulatory streamlining designed to get affordable EVs to market as quickly as possible.
The agricultural component can't be overlooked either because it shows how Canada is thinking systemically about this relationship. China's commitment to reduce canola tariffs is expected to unlock nearly $3 billion in export orders for Canadian producers. For a country that saw its China trade fall by 10.4% in 2025, that's substantial economic relief.
But let's talk about what's really driving Canada's strategic calculus here, because it's more complex than simple economic opportunism.
Absolutely. Prime Minister Carney has been explicit about viewing this as economic diversification. There's a sense in Ottawa that over-reliance on the U.S. as a trading partner creates vulnerability, especially given what Canadian officials describe as unpredictable American trade policies.
This is where intelligence architecture becomes crucial. Canada is making a calculated bet that building economic ties with China, particularly in emerging technologies like EVs, strengthens its negotiating position globally. It's not just about today's trade flows, it's about positioning for tomorrow's economic landscape.
The joint venture component is particularly strategic. Chinese companies have already expressed interest in partnering with Canadian firms to produce EVs domestically. There's even speculation about BYD evaluating battery production facilities in Halifax.
But here's where it gets complicated. Intelligence architecture isn't just about economic flows, it's about technological sovereignty. Joint ventures with Chinese firms inevitably raise questions about intellectual property protection, technology transfer, and long-term strategic autonomy.
Now here's where this story gets really interesting from a domestic politics perspective. Canada's provinces are split right down the middle on this deal, and their reactions tell us everything about the economic tensions this creates.
Ontario has come out swinging against this agreement, and when you understand Ontario's position in Canada's auto ecosystem, you understand why Premier Doug Ford is pulling no punches.
Ford called it a terrible, terrible miscalculated decision and a self-inflicted wound to an already injured Canadian auto industry. He's even referring to Chinese EVs as subsidized spy cars.
Ford's argument is that the deal grants China a foothold in the Canadian market that will be exploited to the detriment of Canadian auto jobs. And he's got legitimate concerns. Ontario hosts the vast majority of Canada's automotive manufacturing.
But here's what makes Ford's opposition particularly sharp. He says the federal government didn't consult Ontario before announcing the deal, calling it a knee-jerk reaction. That's a direct shot at federal-provincial coordination on trade policy.
Unifor, the union representing Canadian auto workers, has echoed Ford's criticisms, with National President Lana Payne calling the deal a self-inflicted wound that risks transforming Canada into a dumping ground for heavily subsidized Chinese electric vehicles.
Meanwhile, British Columbia sees this completely differently. They're framing this as a win for British Columbia's economy. The Vancouver Fraser Port Authority is anticipating handling increased volumes of imported EVs, which means more jobs in logistics and port operations.
BC's perspective makes sense when you consider their context. They don't have the same legacy auto manufacturing base as Ontario. Instead, they're focused on achieving aggressive climate targets, and affordable EVs help them get there faster.
Quebec's reaction, or lack thereof, is fascinating. The province has been notably quiet, and strategically, that makes sense. Quebec has positioned itself as Canada's EV battery manufacturing hub, focusing on critical minerals and battery production rather than final vehicle assembly.
Quebec launched its plan for the development of critical and strategic minerals in 2020, aiming to leverage its lithium, cobalt, and nickel resources along with hydroelectricity to become a hub for EV battery production. Chinese EV demand could actually benefit Quebec's upstream strategy.
This provincial split reveals something crucial about how trade policy intersects with regional economic interests. Ontario sees threat to existing jobs. BC sees new economic opportunities. Quebec sees potential synergies with their strategic focus.
From an intelligence architecture perspective, this fragmentation creates complexity for policy coordination. You've got different provinces with different interests, potentially creating different regulatory approaches to the same vehicles and technologies.
And that brings us to the bigger question about how this provincial discord affects Canada's ability to present a unified front on automotive policy, especially when dealing with both Chinese investment and U.S. trade pressure.
This concludes part 1 of our deep dive into Canada's EV deal with China. Coming up, we'll explore how this creates immediate tensions within USMCA and the strong reactions from American automakers and labour unions.
This is where Canada's Gambit creates immediate friction within North America, because trade relationships here aren't just bilateral, they're triangulated through USMCA, and the implications are getting messy fast.
The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement requires up to 75% North American content for automotive goods to qualify for duty-free treatment. Canada's new arrangement with China doesn't directly violate this, but it creates complications for the integrated supply chain that USMCA was designed to protect.
The U.S. reaction has been, let's call it complex and contradictory. President Trump reportedly called the deal a good thing, saying if you can get a deal with China, you should do that. But other administration officials have been far more critical.
Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy warned that Canada will live to regret the day they partner with China and bring in their vehicles, emphasising concerns that China aims to take over the auto industry. This reflects broader US anxieties about Chinese industrial strategy and economic warfare.
The cybersecurity dimension adds another layer of US concern. U.S. officials have made clear that Chinese vehicles entering Canada would not be allowed into the United States, citing existing regulations and cybersecurity concerns about connected vehicle data collection.
Mexico's position is particularly interesting here because it shows how each USMCA partner is developing its own China strategy. Mexico implemented its own tariffs, up to 50% on passenger cars from countries without free trade agreements, including China, effective January 1st, 2026.
So we have 3 USMCA partners with 3 completely different approaches to Chinese automotive imports. The US maintains 100% tariffs. Canada drops to 6.1%. Mexico imposes 50% tariffs. This fragmentation has profound implications for automotive intelligence systems.
Companies operating across North America now need to navigate 3 different regulatory environments for Chinese vehicle content, 3 different tariff structures, and 3 different sets of safety and cybersecurity requirements. That's not just operational complexity, it's strategic vulnerability.
The 2026 USMCA review, which is mandated by the agreement, becomes critically important here. The U.S. may seek to explicitly address concerns about Chinese EV imports during these negotiations.
Here's what most people miss. This isn't just about trade policy, it's about the fundamental architecture of North American automotive intelligence. For decades, the assumption was that supply chains would become increasingly integrated across the 3 countries.
Canada's deal with China suggests a different model, one where countries pursue bilateral arrangements that optimize for their specific economic needs, even if that creates complications for regional integration.
From an intelligence perspective, this creates both opportunities and vulnerabilities. Opportunities because diverse supply chains can be more resilient, vulnerabilities because they're harder to monitor, secure, and optimize across different regulatory frameworks.
The bigger question is whether this represents the beginning of a broader shift away from regional trade integration toward more bilateral, opportunistic arrangements. If so, that has profound implications for how automotive companies think about supply chain intelligence and risk management.
The reaction from Detroit has been swift and largely negative, which tells us a lot about how established automakers view the competitive threat from Chinese EVs and what they see as the future battleground.
Ford has been particularly vocal, explicitly slamming Carney's deal with China on EVs and urging the Canadian government to fix this mess. That's unusually direct language from a major automaker criticizing a sovereign government's trade policy.
The broader industry concern is that this brings Chinese EVs another step closer to US soil. Even though these vehicles can't legally enter the US market, their presence in Canada creates competitive pressure that ripples across North America, especially in border regions.
Mark Wakefield from Alex Partners put it in stark terms. Chinese brands are expected to account for 30% of the global market by 2030. His warning was that American car makers risk becoming uncompetitive globally if they don't adapt to this new reality.
But let's talk about the specific winners and losers emerging from this deal, because not all companies are positioned equally.
Tesla is actually positioned as an immediate winner. Tesla has been importing Model 3 and Model Y vehicles from its Shanghai Gigafactory for Canadian sales since 2023. They already have 39 stores across Canada and established certification processes.
Before the 100% tariffs were imposed, Tesla was importing over 44,000 EVs into Canada from Shanghai. They shifted to US and Berlin production during the tariff period, but now they can optimize their supply chain again.
For BYD, this opens an entirely new market segment. BYD actually surpassed Tesla in worldwide EV sales in 2025, and now they have access to North American consumers at competitive price points.
Companies like Volvo and Polestar, which are owned by Chinese company Geely but have established North American operations, are also positioned to benefit. They can leverage Chinese manufacturing cost advantages while utilizing existing dealer networks.
The labor dimension adds urgency to these concerns. Unifor highlighted that Chinese manufacturers often pay around $4 per hour compared to about $44 per hour plus benefits for unionized workers at companies like GM and Stellantis.
That's not just a wage gap, it's a fundamental difference in labor standards, environmental regulations, and manufacturing costs that makes direct competition extremely difficult. The UAW hasn't issued a specific statement on this deal yet, but their position is easy to infer from Unifor's response.
Unifor argued that providing a foothold to cheap Chinese EVs, backed by massive state subsidies, overproduction, and designed to expand market share through exports, puts Canadian auto jobs at risk while rewarding labor violations and unfair trade practices.
This raises fundamental questions about the intelligence architecture of global competition. Chinese EV manufacturers have cost advantages that go beyond efficiency. They're embedded in different regulatory environments, different labor standards, and different financial structures, including state support.
Industry estimates suggest BYD's production costs are approximately one-third lower than European and American competitors. That's not a gap that can be closed through incremental efficiency improvements or better marketing.
For American automakers, this deal forces a strategic recalculation. Do they double down on technological differentiation and premium positioning? Do they accelerate their own supply chain localization? Or do they seek their own partnerships with Chinese manufacturers?
The intelligence question becomes, how do you compete with an adversary who has fundamentally different cost structures and strategic objectives? Traditional competitive intelligence frameworks aren't designed for this kind of asymmetric competition where one player has state backing and different rules.
You're listening to Auto Intelligence, produced by Autoagentic.
Autoagentic is building the intelligence foundation for the automotive industry.
2024 and 2025 were foundation years. Organizations explored, tools spread, but intelligence remained fragmented.
2026 is different. This is the year automotive shifts from pilots to playbooks, from isolated AI use to coordinated intelligence systems.
Autoagentic is working directly with select dealer groups and OEM environments to build and codify those playbooks.
From 2027 onward, intelligence moves to the ecosystem level. By 2030, agentic orchestration becomes the standard for industry leaders.
That's the future Autoagentic is building toward.
Now, back to today's conversation. Coming up next, we'll dive deep into the cybersecurity implications of connected Chinese vehicles and how this impacts Five Eyes intelligence sharing, followed by an analysis of China's global EV dominance. Now we need to talk about the elephant in the room, or should I say, the rolling computer in the driveway. Modern EVs aren't just vehicles, they're sophisticated data collection and transmission platforms, and the cybersecurity implications of this deal go far beyond typical trade policy.
Connected vehicles collect vast amounts of sensitive data, location patterns, driving behavior, biometric information from voice recognition, even footage from internal and external cameras. We're talking about rolling surveillance platforms that know more about your daily routine than your smartphone.
The cybersecurity risks with Chinese EVs stem directly from China's legal framework, and this is where things get genuinely concerning. China's national intelligence law, passed in 2017, obligates Chinese organizations and citizens to support, assist, and cooperate with the state intelligence work.
This means Chinese manufacturers could be legally compelled to provide the Chinese government with access to data collected by vehicles operating in Canada, or even to build backdoors into their systems. Such access could lead to mass surveillance, intellectual property theft, or the ability to remotely control or disrupt vehicles.
Think about what this means operationally. Every Chinese EV on Canadian roads becomes a potential intelligence collection point. They can track government officials, business leaders, military personnel, anyone whose movement patterns or associations might be strategically valuable.
This creates what intelligence analysts call rolling spy vans, vehicles that appear to be consumer products but are actually intelligence platforms. The data they collect includes not just where you go, but when you go there, how fast you drive, who you call while driving, and even conversations in the vehicle.
Canadian data privacy laws, primarily PIPEDA, require organizations to obtain consent for data collection and remain accountable for personal information even when transferred outside Canada. But China's legal environment creates a direct conflict.
China's personal information protection law and data security law, while appearing to protect personal data, also include provisions that allow the state to collect and access data for national security interests. So data from Canadian users of Chinese EVs could become accessible to Chinese intelligence agencies, completely bypassing Canadian privacy protections.
The Five Eyes implications here are profound. The Five Eyes Alliance, Canada, United States, United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, is a long-standing intelligence sharing partnership that depends on trust and common security standards.
The alliance has consistently expressed collective concerns about China's technological advancements, intellectual property theft, and broader national security threats. Canadian CSIS Director David Vigneault has openly spoken about China's interest in Canadian technology for dual-use applications.
Canada's decision to facilitate Chinese EV imports could be perceived by its allies as weakening the collective stance against Chinese technological penetration. Countries like the US have initiated investigations into national security risks of Chinese-made smart cars and imposed high tariffs.
By diverging from this approach, Canada risks being seen as less committed to the alliance's shared security objectives. That could impact intelligence sharing, particularly regarding technology and cybersecurity threats. When your closest allies don't trust the security of your domestic vehicle fleet, that creates operational complications.
Canada does have a vehicle cybersecurity strategy through Transport Canada, emphasizing collaboration, robust security practices, and a risk-based approach. But the direct import of Chinese EVs complicates enforcement of these security standards.
Here's the challenge. How do you audit the cybersecurity of vehicles manufactured in China? How do you verify that data isn't being transmitted to unauthorized parties? How do you ensure that over-the-air updates don't introduce new vulnerabilities or capabilities?
Even at the component level, Chinese technologies pose risks. Cellular IoT modules that enable internet connectivity in vehicles are increasingly dominated by Chinese companies. These components could contain vulnerabilities that are impossible to detect without access to source code and manufacturing processes.
From an intelligence architecture perspective, this creates a fundamental asymmetry. Canadian security agencies need to assume that Chinese EVs are potential intelligence collection platforms, while also managing the economic and political benefits of affordable transportation options.
The broader question is whether democratic governments can accept the cybersecurity risks of Chinese-connected vehicles in exchange for economic benefits, or whether this represents a fundamental incompatibility between open markets and national security.
To understand why Canada made this deal and what it means globally, you have to appreciate just how dominant China has become in EV production and how that dominance is reshaping worldwide automotive markets and competitive dynamics.
The numbers are staggering. China accounted for over 70% of the world's electric car production in 2024, with Chinese OEMs dominating over 80% of their domestic output. But it's not just about domestic production. It's about a coordinated global export strategy.
Chinese EV exports doubled in 2025, with Europe emerging as the primary destination. Global EV sales reached 20.7 million units in 2025, a 20% increase, and China alone contributed 12.9 million units to that total.
What's particularly striking is the cost advantage that goes beyond traditional manufacturing efficiency. We mentioned BYD earlier, but it's worth emphasizing BYD's production costs are reportedly one-third lower than European and American competitors. That's not just scale, that's structural advantage from state support, integrated supply chains, and different regulatory costs.
BYD actually surpassed Tesla in worldwide EV sales in 2025. Think about that trajectory. A company that was barely known outside China 5 years ago is now the world's largest EV manufacturer by volume, and they're aggressively expanding internationally.
Europe's response has been particularly interesting to watch because it shows how different regions are adapting to Chinese EV dominance. Initially, the EU imposed additional tariffs ranging from 7.8% to 35.3% on Chinese EVs in October 2024.
But by January 2026, they've shifted strategy. China and the EU have agreed to replace high tariffs with minimum price mechanisms for Chinese EV exports. This is fascinating. It's essentially saying you can sell here, but not below a certain price floor. It preserves market access while addressing concerns about dumping.
But here's the thing. Despite the tariffs, Chinese brands still managed to exceed 10% of the EU's battery electric vehicle market in 2025, up from 8% in 2023. The tariffs slowed growth, but didn't stop it.
The strategic response from Chinese manufacturers has been sophisticated. Companies like BYD are establishing local production facilities within Europe. BYD's plant in Hungary is slated for trial production in early 2026. By 2026, almost half of Chinese OEMs' overseas manufacturing capacity will be located in Europe.
This is intelligence architecture in action. When you face trade barriers, you don't just lobby against them, you restructure your operations to work within them. Chinese companies are turning tariff challenges into opportunities for local investment and job creation, which makes them harder to oppose politically.
Asia outside of China presents a different dynamic. The Asian EV market, excluding China, is projected to grow at a 13.2% compound annual growth rate between 2026 and 2031. The ASEAN EV market alone is forecasted to grow from $4.55 billion in 2025 to $23.58 billion by 2031.
Southeast Asian nations and India are rapidly evolving into new EV manufacturing hubs, largely due to government incentives, focus on affordable local production, and abundant access to critical raw materials. This creates interesting competitive dynamics where Chinese companies compete not just with Western firms, but with emerging local players.
What we're seeing is the emergence of multiple regional ecosystems, each with different cost structures, regulatory environments, and strategic objectives. China's approach to Canada is part of a broader strategy to establish footholds in each of these ecosystems before local competition can mature.
The intelligence implication is clear. The automotive industry is becoming increasingly multipolar. Success requires understanding not just global trends, but the specific dynamics of each regional market and how they interconnect through supply chains, technology transfer, and competitive positioning.
Coming up in our final segment, we'll explore the environmental paradox of this deal, Canada's critical minerals strategy, and what this signals for the future of global automotive competition and intelligence architecture.
Here's an angle that most coverage is missing. This deal creates fascinating contradictions around environmental goals and supply chain sustainability that reveal the complexity of modern trade relationships.
Canada has aggressive climate targets, and EVs are central to achieving them. But there's an environmental paradox here. Is importing EVs from China better or worse for global carbon emissions than building them domestically?
The carbon footprint question is complicated. Chinese EVs manufactured with electricity from coal-heavy grids, then shipped across the Pacific, might have higher embedded emissions than vehicles produced in Canada using hydroelectric power. But Chinese manufacturing scale and efficiency could offset transportation emissions.
Then there's the critical minerals dimension, which gets to the heart of Canada's long-term strategy. Canada possesses significant reserves of minerals essential for EV batteries: nickel, lithium, rare earth elements, but historically hasn't controlled the processing and refining stages.
China maintains a dominant position in processing critical minerals. 85% of the world's nickel refining, 70% of cobalt processing, and 91% of rare earth element preparation. This gives China enormous leverage over the clean energy transition globally.
The Canada-China EV deal should be understood partly as Canada's attempt to leverage its raw material advantages while gaining access to Chinese processing expertise and manufacturing scale. Projects like the Crawford Nickel project in Ontario are positioning Canada to unlock vast nickel reserves and establish processing plants.
If Chinese investment accelerates these projects, Canada could become a more substantial player in the global battery supply chain. But this creates what intelligence analysts call a dual-use dependency. The same supply chains that make Canadian EVs more affordable also increase Canadian dependence on Chinese processing technologies.
China's control over critical mineral processing, especially for heavy rare earths, gives it significant leverage over the clean energy and defense sectors of industrialized nations. This isn't just economic leverage, it's geopolitical leverage with national security implications.
There's also the end-of-life question that nobody's talking about yet. What happens to Chinese EV batteries when they reach end of life in Canada? Who's responsible for recycling? Where does that recycling happen? Do the materials get shipped back to China?
The technological sovereignty question becomes acute when you consider that batteries account for around 40% of EV costs. Control over battery technology and supply chains increasingly determines competitive advantage in the entire automotive industry.
What's particularly interesting is how this plays into the broader trend toward supply chain regionalization. The Economist Intelligence Unit noted that tariffs and geopolitical risks are compelling global manufacturers to accelerate regionalization of their supply chains.
Canada's deal creates a specific pathway for Chinese EV technology into North America through a managed quota system. But it also potentially creates vulnerabilities if that dependence becomes too deep or if geopolitical tensions escalate and supply chains get disrupted.
The broader pattern we're seeing globally is that countries are being forced to choose between economic efficiency and strategic autonomy. Canada's deal represents a bet that the economic benefits outweigh the strategic risks, at least in the near term.
But intelligence systems require long-term thinking. The choices countries make about supply chain dependencies today will shape their strategic options for decades. That's the real stakes of this deal beyond the immediate economic impacts.
Let's step back and think about what this Canada-China deal signals for the future of global automotive trade and competition. Because this isn't just about one bilateral agreement, it's about a fundamental shift in how countries balance economic opportunity with strategic alignment.
The immediate scenario is that Canada becomes a testing ground for managed integration of Chinese EVs into North American markets. If this works, if Canada successfully attracts Chinese investment while maintaining technological sovereignty, it could become a model for other countries facing similar trade-offs.
But there are also significant downside risks. Critics worry that Canada could become what they call a dumping ground for Chinese EVs, undermining domestic automotive jobs while providing limited long-term economic benefit.
Chinese firms have already shown interest in acquiring Canadian lithium and rare earth assets, which suggests a strategic intent to secure upstream supply chains rather than just market access. This could be beneficial if it accelerates Canadian critical minerals development, or problematic if it creates strategic dependencies.
The global implications are profound. If Canada's approach proves successful, we might see other countries pursuing similar bilateral arrangements with China, even if those arrangements complicate existing regional trade agreements like USMCA or EU frameworks.
Europe is already grappling with this. The EU's shift from tariffs to minimum price floors suggests a recognition that Chinese EV penetration is inevitable, and the question becomes how to manage it rather than whether to allow it.
Asian markets outside China are experiencing rapid growth. The ASEAN EV market is projected to reach $23.58 billion by 2031. These markets represent opportunities for both Chinese expansion and competition from other manufacturers, creating a complex multipolar competitive landscape.
The intelligence architecture challenge is that success increasingly requires understanding not just your direct competitors, but entire ecosystems of government policy, supply chain dependencies, technological capabilities, and geopolitical relationships.
Looking ahead 5 to 10 years, we're likely to see the automotive industry become increasingly regionalized, with different regions having different dominant players, different cost structures, and different regulatory approaches. But those regions will be interconnected through technology transfer, supply chain relationships, and strategic partnerships.
China's strategy appears to be establishing footholds in each of these regions through a combination of exports, local investment, and supply chain integration. Canada represents one piece of that broader puzzle, but it's a strategically important piece because of North American market access.
For American automakers, this creates both challenges and opportunities. The challenge is increased competition from lower-cost, technologically sophisticated Chinese vehicles. The opportunity is learning from Chinese manufacturing and supply chain innovations, potentially through partnerships or technology licensing.
But perhaps the most significant implication is for the concept of national champions in the automotive industry. The era when each major market was dominated by domestic manufacturers is clearly ending. The future belongs to companies that can operate effectively across multiple regulatory and cultural environments.
That requires a level of adaptive intelligence that goes far beyond traditional manufacturing or engineering capabilities. Companies need to understand regulatory frameworks, cultural preferences, supply chain vulnerabilities, and geopolitical risks across dozens of markets simultaneously.
From Canada's perspective, the success of this deal will be measured not just by immediate trade volumes or investment flows, but by whether it strengthens Canada's long-term position in the global automotive ecosystem. Does it make Canada more strategically autonomous or more dependent? Does it create jobs or eliminate them? Does it accelerate the clean energy transition or compromise national security?
The broader lesson for other countries is that the traditional choice between economic integration and strategic autonomy may be giving way to more complex arrangements that try to capture benefits while managing risks. These arrangements require sophisticated intelligence capabilities to monitor and adjust over time.
What we're witnessing is the emergence of a new model of international economic relations, one that's more transactional, more bilateral, and more explicitly focused on technological competition. The automotive industry, because of its centrality to both economic prosperity and national security, is becoming a key arena where these new models are being tested.
So, where does this leave us? Canada's EV deal with China represents more than just a trade agreement. It's a strategic bet on how to navigate the complex intersection of economic opportunity, technological sovereignty, and geopolitical rivalry in an increasingly multipolar world.
For the automotive industry, this deal accelerates trends that were already underway. The regionalization of supply chains, the rise of Chinese manufacturers as global leaders, and the increasing importance of government policy in shaping market outcomes and competitive dynamics.
The intelligence implications are profound and multifaceted. Success in this environment requires understanding not just market dynamics, but the complex interplay of trade policy, cybersecurity vulnerabilities, technological sovereignty, supply chain resilience, and strategic competition between major powers.
For Canadian consumers, the immediate impact might be access to more affordable electric vehicles that accelerate the clean energy transition. For Canadian manufacturers, the impact depends on whether they can leverage Chinese investment and technological partnerships to strengthen their competitive position, or whether they get overwhelmed by low-cost competition.
The provincial split we discussed, Ontario's strong opposition, British Columbia's enthusiasm, Quebec's strategic positioning, reveals how the same trade deal can create winners and losers within a single country, complicating policy coordination and implementation.
The cybersecurity and Five Eyes implications add layers of complexity that extend far beyond economics. When your vehicles become potential intelligence collection platforms for a strategic competitor, traditional trade policy frameworks become inadequate for managing the risks.
The broader question is whether this model, managed integration with strategic competitors through bilateral agreements, can be sustained as geopolitical tensions intensify and as the automotive industry becomes even more central to national security infrastructure.
What's certain is that the traditional assumptions about how automotive trade works, regional integration, gradual liberalization, alignment between economic and security interests, are being fundamentally challenged and restructured.
The future belongs to companies and countries that can navigate this more complex, more fragmented landscape while maintaining their strategic autonomy, competitive advantage, and intelligence capabilities. That's not just about better trade deals. It's about building adaptive intelligence systems. This episode was produced by the team at Automotive. Learn more at automotive.ai.
Automotive is building the intelligence foundation for the automotive industry. Founded in 2024, we exist to solve a problem most vendors overlooked. Automotive doesn't suffer from a lack of AI tools, it suffers from a lack of intelligence architecture.
While most platforms optimize individual tasks, Automotive is designed to coordinate entire organizations. Our platform brings together more than 75 specialized automotive agents into a single enterprise intelligence system that operates seamlessly across dealerships, dealer groups, and OEM environments.
This isn't AI layered onto existing workflows, it's intelligence embedded into operations. Our agents share memory, context, and intent across systems, allowing organizations to replace manual handoffs with coordinated agentic execution.
Automotive is LLM agnostic by design. We work directly with frontier AI engineering groups while integrating the strongest capabilities from leading and emerging models, ensuring your intelligence evolves without vendor lock-in or architectural resets.
We created the Automotive Intelligence Pyramid, a 7-level framework that explains how intelligence actually matures in automotive organizations, why most AI initiatives stall at level 3, and what must be true to advance beyond coordination into true agentic orchestration.
From 2024 to 2025, the industry built foundations. 2026 is the year pilots become playbooks. 2027 through 2029 bring ecosystem intelligence. 2030 onward redefines how automotive operates.
In 2026, Automotive is working with a select number of automotive organizations to apply this architecture inside real dealership, dealer group, and OEM environments, building the transformation playbooks the industry will depend on over the next decade.
Automotive doesn't sell AI tools. We build the intelligence systems that allow coordination to emerge, scale, and endure across the complex realities of automotive operations.
Learn more about automotive intelligence architecture at autoagentic.ai.
Special thanks to Barry Hillier, co-founder and CEO of Automotive, for his continued vision in building automotive intelligence architecture that helps organizations navigate exactly these kinds of complex strategic challenges.
We want to hear from you. Send us your thoughts on this Canada-China deal, stories from your dealership or manufacturing operation, insights from your provincial perspective, or ideas for future episodes. Email Barry at autoagentic.ai.
The automotive industry is transforming faster than ever, and intelligence architecture, the ability to coordinate information, insights, and decisions across complex, interconnected systems, is becoming the key differentiator between organizations that thrive and those that get disrupted.
Until next Tuesday, keep building the future of automotive intelligence.
Thanks for listening to Auto Intelligence.